I woke up from a 12-hour spinal fusion surgery to find 17 missed calls and a text message from my son that would shatter everything I thought I knew about the boy I'd raised. Mom, sorry you had to find out this way, but I sold the house yesterday. The money will cover your medical bills and my student loans. You'll understand when you're thinking clearer. The new owners take possession next week. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. No, how are you feeling? No, are you okay after surgery? Just a cold notification that my 32-year-old son had sold my home, the house I'd bought with my bare hands 23 years ago, the place where I'd raised him as a single mother after his father walked out, the sanctuary I'd built from nothing while working 3 jobs and putting myself through nursing school, while I was unconscious on an operating table fighting for my ability to walk again. My name is Dorothy Ashford, and I'm speaking to you from what used to be my guest bedroom in Millbrook Heights, a quiet suburb about 40 minutes outside of Denver. If you're watching this, stay with me, because what my son didn't know when he forged my signature on those sale documents was that 6 months earlier, I had quietly transferred the real deed to a family trust that he had no access to. What he sold was a house he never legally owned to buyers who were about to discover they'd purchased nothing but trouble, and I was about to teach him why you should never betray the woman who taught you everything you know about resilience. But let me paint you the full picture of that morning, because the betrayal goes so much deeper than a simple real estate transaction. I'd been living with degenerative disc disease for 3 years, watching my spine slowly collapse while I continued working as a trauma nurse at Denver General Hospital. The pain had become unbearable. Some days I could barely stand for a full shift, but I kept going because people depended on me, because that's what I'd always done. My son, Trevor, had moved back home 2 years ago after his divorce, claiming he needed time to get back on his feet and finish his master's degree in business administration. For 2 years, I'd supported him, paid his car insurance, his cell phone, bought his groceries, covered his tuition payments when his student loans fell short. When he couldn't find work that met his standards, apparently retail and restaurant jobs were beneath someone with his education, I didn't push. When he spent his days playing video games and his evenings out with friends while I worked double shifts to keep us afloat, I told myself he was just processing his divorce, finding his way. I'd scheduled the surgery for a Thursday morning, a complex spinal fusion that would require 3 days in the hospital and weeks of recovery. Trevor had seemed genuinely concerned in the days leading up to it, asking questions about the procedure, offering to help with preparations. He'd driven me to the hospital that morning, kissed my forehead, and promised he'd be there when I woke up. "Don't worry about anything at home, Mom," he said, squeezing my hand as they wheeled me toward the operating room. "I've got everything handled." He'd handled it, all right. The surgery had complications. What should have been a 6-hour procedure stretched to 12 as surgeons worked to stabilize 3 vertebrae and remove bone fragments that were pressing against my spinal cord. I'd flatlined twice on the table, fought my way back while my son was apparently meeting with real estate agents and signing documents that would make him $250,000 richer and leave his recovering mother homeless. When I finally read that text message, after the nurses had helped me sit up, after the doctor had explained that the surgery was successful, but my recovery would be longer and more difficult than expected, I stared at my phone screen for what felt like an eternity. The words didn't make sense at first. Sold the house. Yesterday. While I was fighting for my life, my own son had been liquidating my entire world? But here's what Trevor didn't understand about his mother. 23 years of single parenthood, of working my way through nursing school while raising a child, of building a life from absolutely nothing, had taught me to think several moves ahead. 6 months earlier, when Trevor had started asking strange questions about the house, its current market value, whether I'd ever considered downsizing, how much equity I'd built up, alarm bells had started ringing in my head.
So I'd done something he never would have expected from his trusting, generous mother. I'd gone to see a lawyer, a sharp woman named Carla Rodriguez, who specialized in estate planning and family protection. Together, we'd created the Ashford Family Trust, a legal entity that technically owned my house while allowing me to live in it for the rest of my life. The deed transfer had been filed quietly, properly, with all the legal documentation sealed and stored in Carla's office safe. The house Trevor sold existed only on outdated public records. The house he'd forged my signature to liquidate belonged to a trust he didn't know existed, controlled by trustees he'd never met, protected by legal structures he'd never bothered to understand. As I lay there in that hospital bed, reading his cold, calculated message, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not yet. Something colder and more powerful. Clarity. For the first time in 2 years, I saw my son exactly as he was. Not a grieving divorcee who needed his mother's support, but a calculating opportunist who had been waiting for the perfect moment to cash in on my generosity. He thought he'd timed it perfectly, his mother unconscious, unable to stop him, unable to fight back. He'd covered his tracks, moved quickly, probably congratulated himself on his business acumen. But Trevor had made one critical miscalculation. He'd underestimated the woman who taught him that in this world you have to be smart to survive, and smarter still, to protect what you've built. And I was about to remind him where he learned everything he thought he knew about strategic thinking. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Let me tell you who I am, because understanding my story means understanding what Trevor threw away when he decided to betray me while I was fighting for my life on that operating table. My name is Dorothy Ashford, and for the past 18 years, I've been a trauma nurse at Denver General Hospital. Not just any nurse. I'm the one they call when a car accident victim comes in with multiple fractures and internal bleeding, when a construction worker falls 3 stories and his family is praying in the waiting room, when a child is rushed in after a playground accident and every second counts. I'm the nurse who holds steady when everyone else is falling apart, who can insert an IV line in a moving ambulance, who can talk a panicked patient through their worst moments while coordinating with surgeons and keeping families informed. I didn't start there, though. 23 years ago, I was a 28-year-old single mother living in a cramped studio apartment in the roughest part of Riverside District, working as a checkout clerk at Fletcher's Grocery during the day and cleaning office buildings at night. Richard was 9 years old then, and his father, my ex-husband Richard, had just walked out on us for a 22-year-old receptionist from his accounting firm. Richard left behind a mountain of debt, a broken-down Honda Civic, and exactly $47 in our checking account. I could have given up. I could have moved back to my parents' farm in Nebraska, accepted their help, and let Trevor grow up believing that sometimes life just beats you down and there's nothing you can do about it. Instead, I made a decision that would define the next 2 decades of our lives. I was going to build something better for my son, no matter what it cost me. I enrolled in the evening nursing program at Colorado Community College while working my 2 jobs. For 4 years, I studied medical terminology and pharmacology after 10-hour shifts on my feet, practiced injection techniques on oranges in our tiny kitchen while Trevor did his homework at the same table, and memorized drug interactions while he slept beside me in our shared bed because we couldn't afford a 2-bedroom apartment. Trevor never went hungry, though. He never wore secondhand clothes to school, never had to explain to his friends why we lived in the cheapest part of town. I made sure of that. I worked holidays so I could afford his soccer cleats, picked up extra cleaning shifts to pay for his class trips, and when he wanted to join the debate team in high school, I found a way to cover the competition fees and travel expenses, even though it meant eating ramen noodles for dinner 3 nights a week.
When I finally graduated nursing school with honors, Trevor was 13. I remember him sitting in the auditorium at my graduation ceremony, wearing the new dress shirt I'd bought him for the occasion, applauding louder than anyone else when they called my name. That was the day I got my first real job at Denver General, the day our life truly began to change. But I didn't stop there. While other nurses were content to work their shifts and go home, I pursued every certification I could get my hands on. Trauma care, pediatric emergency response, cardiac life support, medication administration. I became the nurse that doctors specifically requested for their most critical cases, the one who trained new residents, the one who could handle 3 emergencies simultaneously without breaking a sweat. And with every promotion, every raise, every step up the ladder, I put the money toward building our future. First, we moved to a better apartment in the Meadowbrook district. Then, when Trevor was 16, I found the house, a modest 3-bedroom ranch in Millbrook Heights with a small yard and good schools. The mortgage payments were steep, but I'd learned to be creative with money. I took on extra shifts, worked overtime whenever it was available, and slowly, methodically, turned that house into our home. I painted every room myself, learned to install ceiling fans from YouTube videos, and planted a garden in the backyard where Trevor and I grew tomatoes and herbs every summer. I was building more than just equity. I was building a legacy, a foundation that my son could depend on no matter what life threw at him. When Trevor graduated high school, I was the proudest mother in Colorado. Full academic scholarship to the University of Denver, debate team captain, honor roll every semester. I'd raised a young man who understood the value of hard work, who'd watched his mother build something from nothing and learned that determination could overcome any obstacle. Or so I thought. When he got married to his college girlfriend, Amanda, I helped them with the down payment on their first apartment. When he decided to pursue his master's degree in business administration, I supported that decision, financially and emotionally. When Amanda left him 2 years later, citing his lack of ambition and responsibility, I opened my home to him without question. My son was hurting, and he needed his mother. For 18 years at Denver General, I'd been the person families turned to in their darkest moments. The nurse who stayed late to explain a difficult diagnosis, who held hands with frightened patients, who fought insurance companies and hospital administrators to make sure everyone got the care they deserved. I'd earned the respect of doctors, colleagues, and hundreds of families who trusted me with their most vulnerable moments. I'd built a reputation as someone who could be counted on, someone who never gave up, someone who would fight for what was right no matter how difficult it became. The doctors called me the fortress because when I was on duty, families knew their loved ones were in the most capable hands possible. Trevor grew up watching me save lives, watching me fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves, watching me build a career and a home through sheer determination and an unwavering commitment to doing what was right. He'd learned everything he knew about persistence, about strategic thinking, about standing up for what you believe in, from watching me navigate the most challenging situations imaginable with grace and strength. And now, as I lay in that hospital bed, reading his cold, calculated message about selling my house while I was unconscious, I realized that my biggest mistake hadn't been trusting him. It had been underestimating what he was capable of learning from me. Because if Trevor thought he could outmaneuver the woman who'd taught him everything about survival and strategy, he was about to discover just how much his mother had held back in those lessons. I've dealt with trauma for 18 years. Car accidents where families arrive to find their loved one fighting for life. Construction accidents where a father of 3 might never walk again. Overdoses where a teenager's future hangs by a thread. I've learned to compartmentalize emotion, to stay steady when everyone around me is falling apart. But sitting in that hospital bed, staring at Trevor's text message, I felt something I hadn't experienced since the day his father walked out on us. The cold, paralyzing shock of complete betrayal by someone I'd trusted with everything. My hands started shaking first. Not the gentle tremor of recovery from anesthesia, but the violent shaking that comes when your nervous system realizes it's been ambushed. The phone slipped from my fingers and clattered onto the hospital bedside table, the screen still glowing with those devastating words, "I sold the house yesterday." The pain hit next, and it wasn't from the surgical site where they'd fused 3 vertebrae. This was deeper, sharper. The kind of pain that radiates from your chest and spreads through your entire body like poison. I'd felt it once before, 23 years ago, when Richard told me he was leaving. But this was worse, because Trevor wasn't a husband who'd grown distant. This was my child. The boy I'd carried for 9 months, the baby I'd nursed through fevers and nightmares, the young man I'd sacrificed everything to raise. I pressed the call button for the nurse, not because I needed medical attention, but because I needed another human being to confirm that what I was reading was real. When Jenny Martinez, one of the night shift nurses I worked with for years, appeared in my doorway, she took one look at my face and immediately moved to check my vitals. "Dorothy, what's wrong? Are you in pain?" On a scale of 1 to 10, "Jenny," I whispered, my voice barely audible, "read this. Please just read this and tell me I'm hallucinating from the medication." She took my phone, her expression shifting from professional concern to horror as she read Trevor's message. I watched her face change, saw the exact moment she understood what had happened. Her eyes widened, then narrowed, then filled with something I'd never seen from her before. Pure, protective rage. "This can't be legal," she said immediately. "You were in surgery. You couldn't have signed anything. This has to be fraud." But even as she said it, I knew Trevor had been smarter than that. He'd lived in my house for 2 years, had access to all my financial documents, knew my social security number, my bank account information, had probably practiced my signature a dozen times. In our digital age, with electronic signatures and remote notarizations, a motivated person with the right information could make almost anything look legitimate. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal itself. It was realizing how long he'd been planning it. Those conversations about the house's value weren't casual curiosity. His questions about my medical insurance, about whether the surgery would be covered, about my recovery time. He'd been calculating, timing, waiting for the perfect moment when I'd be most vulnerable. I thought about all the nights I'd worked double shifts to pay his tuition, all the times I'd covered his car insurance when he claimed to be between jobs, all the dinners I'd prepared after 14-hour shifts because I wanted him to feel cared for while he figured out his life. He'd been eating my food, sleeping in my house, using my Wi-Fi password, all while plotting to steal everything I'd built. Jenny sat on the edge of my bed, something she'd never done in all our years of working together. The professional boundary dissolved as she watched me process the magnitude of what had happened. "How could he do this while you were in surgery?" she asked, with a voice thick with disbelief. "While you were fighting for your ability to walk again? What kind of person—" She stopped herself, but I knew what she was thinking. What kind of person betrays their mother while she's unconscious on an operating table? The answer was simple. The kind of person I apparently raised. I started laughing then, a bitter, broken sound that scared both of us. Because the irony was so perfect, it was almost artistic. For 2 years, I'd been worried about Trevor's emotional state after his divorce. I'd tiptoed around his moods, made excuses for his unemployment, rationalized his selfishness as grief. I'd been so concerned about his mental health that I'd completely missed the fact that he was perfectly fine, just morally bankrupt. "All this time," I said to Jenny, "I thought he was depressed. I thought he needed space to heal, time to find himself. I was worried about him." The laughing turned to tears, deep, body-shaking sobs that came from a place I'd kept locked away since Richard left. Jenny held my hand while I cried, and I realized this was the first time in 23 years that I'd let another person see me completely broken. I'd been strong for so long. Strong for Trevor, strong for my patients, strong for every family that needed me to hold steady in their worst moments. That I'd forgotten what it felt like to need someone else's strength. But even through the tears, even through the shock and betrayal, something else was stirring. A cold, calculated anger that felt different from anything I'd ever experienced. This wasn't the hot rage of the moment. This was something cooler, more dangerous. The kind of anger that thinks clearly, that plans carefully, that doesn't make mistakes. I wiped my eyes and asked Jenny to hand me my phone. There were now 16 more text messages, all from Trevor. I scrolled through them, watching his tone shift from confident to concerned to panicked as he realized I wasn't responding the way he'd expected.
Mom, I know you're probably upset, but this is really for the best. The medical bills alone would have bankrupted you. I'm protecting your credit. Mom, please respond. I'm starting to worry. The nurses said you're awake. Why aren't you answering? I can explain everything when you're feeling better. Mom, you're scaring me. Please, just text me back. Each message revealed more about his expectations, about how he'd imagined this would play out. He'd expected gratitude, or at least resigned acceptance. He'd thought I'd be too weak, too overwhelmed by medical recovery, too dependent on his help to fight back. He'd calculated that his sick, vulnerable mother would have no choice but to accept what he'd done. That was his first mistake, assuming that physical vulnerability meant mental weakness. His second mistake was forgetting that I'd been making impossible decisions under extreme pressure for nearly 2 decades. His third mistake was thinking that because I'd been generous with him, I was naive about the world. But his biggest mistake was not understanding that the woman who'd built a life from nothing, who'd worked her way through nursing school while raising a child alone, who'd earned the respect of doctors and colleagues through sheer competence and determination, wasn't going to roll over and play victim for anyone, not even her own son. I looked at Jenny, my colleague, my friend, who was still sitting beside me with tears in her eyes, and I felt something click into place. The crying was over. The shock was fading. What remained was the same clear-headed focus I'd felt in every emergency room crisis, every life-or-death moment when other people looked to me for answers. "Jenny," I said, my voice steady now, "I need you to do me a favor. Call the nursing supervisor and tell her I'll need extended medical leave. Then call Dr. Patterson and ask him to document everything about my condition today, the surgery, the recovery timeline, my mental state, everything." She looked confused. "Dorothy, what are you planning?" I picked up my phone and looked at Trevor's increasingly desperate messages. Soon, he'd realize that his mother's silence wasn't weakness or confusion. Soon, he'd understand that Dorothy Ashford didn't stay down when she was knocked down. She got back up swinging. "I'm planning to teach my son a lesson about what happens when you mistake kindness for stupidity, and he's about to learn why you should never, ever underestimate a trauma nurse who's had 23 years to get very, very good at handling emergencies." Over the next few hours, as the morphine wore off and my head cleared, I began to see Trevor's betrayal not as an isolated incident, but as the culmination of a pattern I'd been willfully blind to for years. The signs had been there, subtle at first, then increasingly bold, but I'd explained them away because I wanted to believe in the son I'd raised, not the man he'd actually become. It started when he moved back home 2 years ago. I'd been so focused on helping him heal from his divorce that I missed the red flags immediately. Amanda, his ex-wife, had called me the week before she filed for divorce. I'd always liked Amanda. She was practical, hardworking, the kind of young woman who reminded me of myself at that age. What she told me during that tearful phone conversation should have been my first warning. "Dorothy, I love Trevor, but I can't live with someone who thinks the world owes him something. He hasn't held a steady job in 3 years. Every time he gets fired or quits, it's someone else's fault. His boss was jealous, his coworkers were incompetent, the company was poorly managed. He's never responsible for anything that goes wrong in his life." I defended him then, told Amanda that Trevor was just going through a difficult period, that some people took longer to find their path. I even offered to help with their marriage counseling costs. But Amanda had seen something I couldn't, or wouldn't, acknowledge. "He's been asking about your house," she'd continued, "how much it's worth, whether you'd ever thought about selling, what would happen to it if something happened to you. Dorothy, I think he's counting on inheriting your money instead of building his own life." I dismissed her concerns as divorce bitterness, convinced she was trying to turn me against my son. When Trevor moved back home, heartbroken and defeated, I saw it as an opportunity to rebuild our relationship, to help him get back on his feet. I never considered that he might be executing a long-term plan.
The first few months seemed normal. Enough. Trevor was depressed, understandably so, and I gave him space to grieve. I cooked his favorite meals, did his laundry, and didn't push when he spent most days in his room playing video games. When he started asking casual questions about my finances, how much I owed on the mortgage, what my pension would be worth, whether I'd updated my will, I thought he was just concerned about my future security.
Mom, you're not getting any younger, he'd said one evening over dinner. Have you thought about what would happen if you got sick and couldn't work? These medical jobs are so physically demanding. Maybe you should consider downsizing, investing the money somewhere safer. I had appreciated his concern. After all, I was 51 years old, and trauma nursing was taking a toll on my body. The back pain had started 3 years earlier, and some days I could barely stand for a full shift. Trevor's suggestion seemed practical, loving even. But then the questions became more specific. He wanted to know about my insurance policies, my retirement accounts, the exact amount of equity I built in the house. When I mentioned that I was considering spinal surgery for my deteriorating discs, his interest in my financial situation intensified dramatically. Surgery is expensive, Mom, even with insurance. What if there are complications? What if you can't work for months? You could lose everything you've built. He'd paused, then added with what I thought was genuine concern, maybe we should look into selling the house now, while the market's good. You could buy something smaller, bank the difference, have a safety net. I'd been touched by his apparent worry for my financial security. Here was my son, still struggling with his own life, taking time to think about my future. It seemed like evidence that I'd raised him right, that underneath his current struggles was a young man who cared about his mother's well-being. The manipulation was so subtle, so perfectly crafted that I never saw it coming. Trevor had learned from watching me handle difficult situations. He knew that I responded to logical arguments and practical concerns. He knew that I was a planner, someone who thought ahead and prepared for contingencies. So he positioned himself as my advisor, my protector, the son who was looking out for my mother's best interests. Meanwhile, his own behavior grew increasingly concerning. He had been job hunting for 2 years, but somehow never found anything suitable. His standards were impossibly high. He wouldn't consider retail work because it was beneath his education level, wouldn't take restaurant jobs because they were temporary solutions, and turned down office positions because they offered no growth potential. I covered his car payments when his savings ran out. I paid his health insurance premiums when he aged out of his ex-wife's plan. I bought his groceries, covered his cell phone, and even gave him spending money for networking events that never seemed to lead anywhere. When friends asked why I was supporting a grown man, I defended him fiercely. He's been through a traumatic divorce, I'd tell anyone who questioned the arrangement. Sometimes the most successful people take longer to find their footing. I'd rather support him now than watch him make desperate decisions later. What I didn't realize was that Trevor had no intention of finding his footing. He'd found something better, a mother who would bankroll his lifestyle indefinitely while he waited for the optimal moment to cash in on her generosity. The pattern became clearer when I looked back at his childhood behavior. Even as a teenager, Trevor had been skilled at avoiding consequences for his actions. When he got caught cheating on a test in high school, it was because the teacher had it out for him. When he wrecked his first car, it was because of bad road conditions that somehow hadn't affected any other drivers. When he got suspended for skipping classes, it was because the school's attendance policy was unreasonable. I'd attributed this to normal teenage behavior, to a young man still learning to take responsibility. I thought that maturity would eventually teach him accountability. Instead, I'd inadvertently trained him to believe that there would always be someone, namely me, to clean up his messes and absorb the costs of his poor decisions. The most damning evidence came from something I discovered in his room 3 months after he moved back home. I'd been putting away his clone laundry when I noticed a notebook on his desk, open to a page covered with numbers and calculations. At first, I thought it was job-related research, salary comparisons, or budget planning for when he found employment. Then I read more carefully. He'd calculated my net worth down to the penny, the house's current market value, my retirement account balance, my life insurance payout, even the Blue Book value of my car. He'd researched average nursing salaries and estimated how much I could save between now and retirement. He even looked up actuarial tables to estimate my life expectancy. At the bottom of the page, he'd written, conservative estimate, $850K total assets. Aggressive timeline, 3 to 5 years if health issues accelerate retirement. I'd stared at that notebook for 20 minutes, trying to find an innocent explanation for what looked like a financial assessment of my death. Maybe he was planning a surprise for my retirement. Maybe he was worried about my security and wanted to understand the full picture of my finances. Maybe he was considering a business investment and wanted to know if I could help. But deep in my gut, I knew what I was looking at, a plan. Trevor wasn't living with me temporarily while he rebuilt his life. He was conducting surveillance, gathering intelligence, waiting for the optimal moment to monetize our relationship.
I'd closed the notebook and never mentioned what I'd seen. Instead, I'd started paying closer attention, and what I noticed made my blood run cold. Trevor wasn't depressed or struggling. He was patient and calculating. He was living comfortably on my income while researching exactly how much my death or disability would be worth to him. Now, lying in this hospital bed after major surgery, I understood that Trevor's betrayal wasn't impulsive or emotional. It was strategic. He'd spent 2 years studying my vulnerabilities, learning my routines, documenting my assets, and waiting for the perfect opportunity. My spinal surgery had provided that opportunity, a guaranteed period of vulnerability when I'd be too weak to fight back and too dependent on his help to risk alienating him. He'd played the long game, and he'd played it well. What he didn't know was that his mother had been playing an even longer game, and she was about to show him exactly how much he'd underestimated the woman who taught him everything he thought he knew about strategy. The most painful part of understanding Trevor's betrayal wasn't the shock of what he'd done. It was realizing how many times I'd convinced myself that this time would be different, that this conversation, this opportunity, this moment would finally be when my son became the man I'd raised him to be. For 2 years, I'd been locked in a cycle of hope and crushing disappointment, making excuses for behavior that should have sent me running. I remembered the exact moment I first thought Trevor might be turning a corner. It was about 8 months after he'd moved back home, and I'd been covering his expenses while he searched for the right opportunity. I'd come home from a particularly brutal shift at the hospital, a car accident involving a family of 4, 2 children who didn't make it, and found Trevor in the kitchen, actually cooking dinner. Not heating up leftovers or ordering takeout on my credit card, but genuinely cooking. He'd made chicken parmesan from scratch, set the table with actual napkins, and even bought flowers for the centerpiece. "I wanted to do something nice for you, Mom," he'd said when I walked in. "I know how hard you've been working, and I thought you deserved to come home to a real meal for once." I nearly cried with relief. Finally, I thought, he's starting to understand. He's seeing how much I sacrifice for this family, and he wants to contribute. We'd had a wonderful dinner together, talking about his job prospects, his plans for the future, his gratitude for my support during his difficult time. He seemed genuinely motivated, talking about companies he'd researched and interviews he was planning to schedule. For 3 weeks after that dinner, I lived on the hope that Trevor was finally growing up. I found myself bragging to my colleagues about how he was turning his life around, how proud I was that he was taking initiative. I started making plans for how we'd celebrate when he got his first job, imagining the moment when he'd hand me his first rent check and we'd both know he was truly independent. Then I got my credit card statement.
While I'd been glowing with pride over his thoughtfulness, Trevor had charged $400 worth of groceries for that one meal. Premium steaks, expensive wine, imported cheeses, everything from the most expensive section of the supermarket. The flowers alone had cost $75. He'd spent more on one dinner than I typically spent on groceries for an entire month, and he'd done it with my money while pretending it was his gesture of appreciation. When I confronted him about it, he seemed genuinely confused by my anger. "But Mom, I wanted to make you something special. You always say I don't appreciate what you do for me, so I made you a really nice dinner. Isn't that what you wanted?" The logic was so twisted, so perfectly crafted to make me feel guilty for being upset that I'd actually apologized. I'd convinced myself that his heart was in the right place, that he was still learning how to manage money responsibly, that at least he was thinking about my happiness. I'd absorbed the $400 charge and told myself it was an investment in his emotional growth. That pattern repeated itself dozens of times over the next 18 months. Trevor would do something thoughtful, clean the house, run errands, cook a meal, and I'd feel that familiar surge of hope. Maybe this was the breakthrough moment. Maybe he was finally understanding what it meant to be a contributing member of our household. Then I discovered the real cost. The cleaning supplies he'd use cost $200. The errands included $150 worth of unnecessary purchases for himself. The meals required ingredients expensive enough to feed a family for a week.
Each time, I'd start to confront him about the excessive spending. And each time, he'd deploy a new strategy to deflect responsibility. Sometimes it was confusion. "I thought you wanted me to do things right. If you wanted me to use cheap ingredients, you should have said so." Sometimes it was guilt. "I'm sorry I tried to do something nice for you. I guess I can't do anything right." Sometimes it was logic. "Mom, if you want me to contribute to the household, I need the right tools and ingredients to do it properly." The most effective manipulation was when he'd frame his excessive spending as an investment in our relationship. "I know I've been a burden since the divorce," he'd say, looking genuinely remorseful. "I wanted to show you how much I appreciate everything you've done for me. I guess I got carried away, but it came from a place of love." How do you argue with that? How do you tell your child that their gesture of love is bankrupting you without sounding like the cruelest mother in the world? So, I'd absorb the costs, tell myself that his intentions mattered more than the execution, and hope that next time he'd be more mindful of our budget. The job search became another endless source of false hope. Trevor would get excited about a position, spend days preparing his application, talk enthusiastically about the company culture and growth opportunities. I'd find myself getting excited too, imagining him in a professional environment, using his intelligence and education productively. Then the interview would go poorly, or the company would reject his application, or he'd decide the position wasn't the right fit after all. Each failure came with a detailed explanation of why it wasn't his fault. The interviewer was unprofessional. The job description was misleading. The company had unrealistic expectations. The salary was insulting for someone with his qualifications. The commute was too long. The office environment seemed toxic. There was always a perfectly reasonable explanation for why this particular opportunity hadn't worked out, and always a promise that the next one would be different. I wanted so desperately to believe in his potential that I accepted every excuse, funded every new strategy, and celebrated every small step forward. When he decided he needed professional interview coaching, I paid for it. When he said he needed a new suit to make the right impression, I bought it. When he claimed that networking events were essential for finding opportunities in his field, I gave him money for conference fees and professional association memberships. The most heartbreaking part was watching him perform the role of a grateful son just long enough to secure my continued support. He'd have moments of genuine seeming appreciation, telling me how lucky he was to have such a supportive mother, promising that he'd pay me back for everything once he got established in his career. He'd share articles about successful people who'd struggled in their 20s and 30s before finding their calling, implying that his current situation was just a temporary setback on the path to eventual success. Some people are late bloomers, Mom, he'd say during our heart-to-heart conversations. I know I'm taking longer than you expected to get my life together, but I promise I'm working on it. I just need to find the right opportunity, the right fit. Once I do, I'll be able to take care of you the way you've taken care of me. Those promises kept me going for 2 years of mounting expenses and diminishing returns. I'd calculate the money I'd spent on his support, easily $40,000 in direct costs, plus the opportunity cost of working extra shifts to cover his expenses, and tell myself it was an investment in his future, in our relationship, in the man he was going to become. The medical questions should have been my final warning. But even those I interpreted through the lens of hope rather than suspicion. When Trevor started asking about my insurance coverage and surgical risks, I thought he was being a caring son, worried about my health and our financial security. When he researched the costs of spinal surgery and recovery time, I was touched that he was taking such an active interest in my medical situation. I want to make sure we're prepared for anything, Mom, he said when I found him reading medical articles about spinal fusion complications. I've been thinking about what would happen if your recovery takes longer than you expected or if there are complications. I want to make sure you're protected. Even now, lying in this hospital bed with the evidence of his betrayal glowing on my phone screen, part of me wanted to find a way to interpret his actions as misguided concern rather than calculated theft. The mother in me wanted to believe that somewhere in his twisted logic, Trevor thought he was helping me, protecting me from financial ruin, making difficult decisions so I wouldn't have to. But the numbers didn't lie. The timing wasn't coincidental. And the careful and methodical way he'd positioned himself as my financial advisor while systematically gathering information about my assets wasn't the behavior of a concerned son. It was the behavior of a predator who'd been patiently waiting for the perfect moment to strike.
The cycle of hope and disappointment was finally broken, not by wisdom or insight, but by the brutal clarity of Trevor's text message. There would be no more excuses, no more explanations, no more promises of future gratitude. My son had shown me exactly who he was, and for the first time in 2 years, I was ready to believe him. The exact moment I stopped being Trevor's victim and started being his opponent occurred at 3:47 a.m. on my second night in the hospital. I know the precise time because I was staring at the digital clock on the wall when something fundamental shifted inside me. Not anger, not hurt, but something colder and infinitely more dangerous. Absolute clarity. I'd been lying awake for hours, not because of the pain from surgery, but because my mind was racing through 23 years of memories, recontextualizing every moment through the lens of Trevor's betrayal. The medication had worn off enough for me to think clearly, and what I was thinking about was a conversation I'd had with my own mother when I was 17, just before I graduated high school. "Dorothy," she'd said, sitting on my childhood bed while I packed for college, "there's something I need to tell you about people, especially people who claim to love you. Some folks will take everything you're willing to give and then take more. They'll use your love against you, make you feel guilty for not giving enough, make you believe that if you just love them a little harder, sacrifice a little more, they'll finally become the person you need them to be." At 17, I'd thought she was being unnecessarily cynical. I dismissed her warning as the bitterness of someone who'd been hurt too many times. But lying in that hospital bed, I finally understood what she'd been trying to tell me. Love without boundaries isn't love, it's enablement. And enablement isn't kindness, it's cruelty disguised as compassion. For 2 years, I'd been so afraid of being the kind of mother who gave up on her child that I'd become the kind of mother who enabled her child to destroy both of us. I'd confused unconditional love with unconditional tolerance, mistaking my willingness to absorb Trevor's failures as evidence of my devotion rather than evidence of my dysfunction.
The turning point wasn't just realizing what Trevor had done, it was realizing what I had allowed to happen. Every excuse I'd made for him, every boundary I'd failed to set, every consequence I'd absorbed on his behalf had been a step toward this moment. I hadn't just raised a son who felt entitled to steal from me. I'd trained him to believe that stealing from me was acceptable, even inevitable. But the moment that crystallized my resolve came when I remembered something Trevor had said 3 weeks before my surgery. We'd been watching a news story about an elderly woman whose son had emptied her bank accounts and left her destitute, and I'd expressed horror at such cruelty. "People like that make me sick," I'd said. "How do you betray someone who sacrificed everything for you? How do you look in the mirror after destroying the person who loved you most?" Trevor had been quiet for a moment, then said something that now sent chills down my spine. Maybe she wasn't as helpless as everyone thinks. Maybe she knew what was happening and just didn't want to admit it. Sometimes people choose to be victims because it's easier than dealing with reality. At the time, I'd thought he was being philosophical, even insightful. Now I understood he'd been testing me, gauging my reaction to see if I suspected what he was planning. He'd been assessing whether I was the kind of person who would fight back or the kind who would accept betrayal as inevitable. That memory triggered something primal in me, something that had been dormant since the day Richard walked out, and I decided I would never again be anyone's victim. I'd built a life from nothing once before. I'd survived abandonment, poverty, and single motherhood through sheer force of will and strategic thinking. I'd earned the respect of doctors and colleagues by being smarter, tougher, and more prepared than anyone expected me to be. Somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten who I was. I'd gotten so comfortable in my success, so confident in my security, that I'd let my guard down with the one person I should have been watching most carefully. I'd allowed maternal love to cloud my judgment, mistaking Trevor's presence in my home for companionship rather than reconnaissance. But that woman, the one who'd built everything from nothing, was still inside me, and she was furious.
I reached for my phone and did something I hadn't done in 2 years. I looked at my bank statements with the cold, analytical eye of someone who suspected she was being robbed. What I found made my blood freeze. Trevor hadn't just been expensive, he'd been systematically draining my accounts. The grocery bills that seemed high because he liked premium brands, the gas charges that seemed frequent because he claimed to be driving to job interviews, the restaurant charges that seemed reasonable because he said he was networking. Added together over 24 months, Trevor had cost me $73,000 in direct expenses. $73,000 that could have paid for my surgery, funded my recovery, secured my retirement. Money I'd earned working double shifts, sacrificing sleep, pushing my deteriorating body past its limits while he played video games and researched the value of my assets. But the financial theft wasn't what broke me. It was the emotional theft. For 2 years, I'd worried about his depression, his self-esteem, his future prospects. I'd lost sleep wondering if I was helping him enough, supporting him properly, giving him the tools he needed to rebuild his life. I'd questioned my own judgment every time I felt frustrated with his lack of progress, convincing myself that I was being impatient, unsympathetic, selfish. He'd stolen my peace of mind. He'd stolen my confidence in my own instincts. He'd stolen my joy in our relationship, turning every interaction into a performance where I had to prove my worthiness as a mother while he evaluated my usefulness as a resource. The woman who'd raised him would have been devastated by this realization. The woman who'd enabled him would have found new ways to rationalize his behavior, new excuses to preserve the illusion of family harmony. But the woman I was becoming in that hospital bed, the woman I'd forgotten I could be, felt something entirely different. I felt free. For the first time in 2 years, I wasn't worried about Trevor's feelings, his future, his fragile emotional state. I wasn't calculating how to help him
or fix him, or save him from himself. I wasn't making plans to absorb his latest crisis or fund his next attempt at self-improvement. Instead, I was thinking about justice. Not revenge, justice. There's a difference that Trevor was about to learn the hard way. I opened my laptop, which Jenny had brought from my house along with some clothes and personal items. Trevor had given her my spirit key, playing the role of the devoted son managing his mother's affairs while she recovered. He'd probably searched through my room while she was packing my things, looking for financial documents or legal papers that might complicate his plans. What he wouldn't have found was the safe deposit box key hidden inside an old medical textbook, or the file of legal documents I kept at the office of my financial advisor, or the carefully maintained relationships I'd built with professionals who understood the importance of protecting assets from family members who might not have their loved ones' best interests at heart. Trevor thought he knew everything about my finances because he'd seen my household accounts and mortgage statements. What he didn't know was that smart women who build wealth from nothing don't keep all their eggs in one basket, especially when they have children who might someday see that wealth as an inheritance they're entitled to claim early. I'd been protecting myself from disaster for 23 years. I just hadn't expected the disaster to come from inside my own home. As I opened my laptop and began to make a series of phone calls that would change both our lives forever, I felt something I hadn't experienced since the day I graduated nursing school. The absolute certainty that I was exactly where I needed to be, doing exactly what needed to be done. Trevor had made the mistake of assuming that his mother's love made her weak. He was about to discover that it had actually made her invincible, and that the woman who taught him everything he knew about strategy had been holding back the most important lessons for exactly this moment. The first call I made was Carla Rodriguez, the estate planning attorney I'd been working with for the past 6 months. It was 4:15 a.m., but Carla had given me her emergency line for exactly this type of situation, when family members might try to take advantage of a medical crisis. She answered on the second ring, alert and professional despite the early hour. "Dorothy, what's happened?" she asked immediately, recognizing the urgency in my voice. "Trevor sold my house while I was in surgery. Or at least, he thinks he did." There was a pause, then a sound that might have been satisfaction. "Did he now? Well, this is going to be interesting. How much did he get for the house that isn't actually his to sell?" According to his text message, enough to cover my medical bills and his student loans. I'm guessing somewhere around $400,000, based on recent comparable sales in the neighborhood.
$400,000 for a house he doesn't own? Carla mused. Dorothy, your son just committed multiple felonies while creating a legal nightmare that's going to follow him for years. Do you want me to walk you through exactly how screwed he is? 6 months earlier, when Trevor's questions about my finances had started making me uncomfortable, I'd made an appointment with Carla Rodriguez on the recommendation of Dr. Sarah Chen, one of the emergency room physicians at Denver General. Dr. Chen had mentioned during a coffee break that she'd had to protect her assets from a gambling-addicted brother, and she'd praised Carla's expertise in family asset protection. "I think my son might be planning something," I told Carla during our first meeting. "He's been asking a lot of questions about my house, my finances, my medical insurance. It might be nothing, but your instincts are telling you to be careful," Carla had finished. "Trust those instincts. I've seen too many families destroyed because someone ignored the warning signs." That first meeting had been eye-opening. Carla explained that adult children stealing from elderly or vulnerable parents was far more common than most people realized, and that the theft often happened during medical crises when the parent was least able to defend themselves. The problem, she said, is that most people don't take protective action until after they've been victimized. By then, the damage is done and recovery is nearly impossible. The smart move is to create legal structures before you need them. Together, we'd crafted what Carla called a family protection plan. The centerpiece was the Ashford Family Trust, a revocable living trust that technically owned all my major assets while allowing me to maintain complete control during my lifetime. The house, my investment accounts, even my car were transferred into the trust's name, with me as the primary trustee and beneficiary. But here's the genius of Carla's strategy.
The trust was structured so that it could become irrevocable instantly if certain trigger events occurred. One of those triggers was attempted fraud or theft by a family member. The moment Trevor forged my signature on those sale documents, he'd activated a clause that locked him out of any inheritance permanently while giving me ironclad legal protection against his actions. The beautiful thing about your son's timing, Carla explained, as I lay in my hospital bed, is that he committed fraud against a trust while you were incapacitated. That's not just theft. It's elder abuse, wire fraud if he used electronic signatures, and potentially federal crimes if the transaction crossed state lines. The penalties are severe, and more importantly, they're mandatory. The trust structure had another layer of protection that Trevor couldn't have anticipated. When I transferred the house deed 6 months ago, I'd also taken out a specialized insurance policy that Carla recommended, title fraud protection, that would not only cover legal costs, but actively prosecute anyone who attempted to illegally transfer trust property. Your insurance company is going to be very interested in this case. They've got teams of investigators and attorneys whose job is to make examples out of people who commit title fraud. They don't just recover the money, they make sure the perpetrators face criminal charges. But the most devastating surprise waiting for Trevor was something even more elegant. The house he'd sold didn't just belong to a trust he couldn't access, it belonged to a trust that had an active lien against it. 3 months ago, following Carla's advice, I'd taken out a small business loan using the house as collateral, not because I needed the money, but because it created a legal encumbrance that would make any unauthorized sale invalid. It's a common asset protection strategy, Carla had explained when we set it up. If someone tries to steal your house, they can't actually complete the sale because there's a lien holder who has to approve the transaction. The loan company will demand proof of authorization before releasing their claims, and when they can't get it, the sale falls through, I'd finished, beginning to understand the brilliance of the strategy. Exactly, and not only does the sale fall through, but the attempted theft triggers penalties that can include immediate seizure of any assets the perpetrator does control. Your son won't just lose the money from the fake sale, he could lose his car, his bank accounts, anything in his name. Now, lying in my hospital bed, while Carla explained the full scope of Trevor's legal exposure, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of being 3 steps ahead of someone who thought they were outsmarting me. So what happens next? I asked. Well, that depends on how merciful you're feeling. I can have him arrested by noon today, or we can let him dig the hole a little deeper first. Either way, he's going to face serious legal consequences. The question is whether you want to give him a chance to make it worse for himself. The irony was perfect. Trevor had spent 2 years studying my finances, researching my vulnerabilities, waiting for the optimal moment to strike. He thought he understood my assets, my legal situation, my capacity to fight back. But he was looking at shadows while the real fortress remained invisible.
Every document he'd found in my house was accurate but incomplete. The mortgage statements showed what I owed, but not the lien structure that protected the property. The bank statements showed my checking and savings accounts, but not the trust accounts or business entities that held the bulk of my wealth. The insurance policies he'd photographed showed my basic coverage, but not the specialized fraud protection that was about to make his life very complicated. "There's something else you should know," Carla said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Remember how I suggested you install those security cameras 6 months ago? The ones your son probably forgot about?" I'd installed a discreet security system on Carla's recommendation, tiny cameras that recorded everything happening in the main areas of my house. Trevor had been so focused on my financial documents that he'd never thought to look for surveillance equipment. "We have video evidence of him going through your personal papers, photographing documents, and meeting with people in your house while you were at work," Carla continued, "including what appears to be a meeting with a real estate agent 3 days before your surgery. Your son didn't just steal from you, Dorothy. He documented the entire conspiracy." The cameras had been my insurance policy, a way to protect myself if Trevor ever claimed I'd given him permission to access my finances or sell my property. Now they were going to be the evidence that sent him to prison.
As I hung up the phone with Carla and began to contemplate the full scope of Trevor's self-destruction, I realized that my son had made the same mistake that had ended his marriage. He'd assumed that the women in his life were weaker and less intelligent than he was. Amanda had tried to warn me about his sense of entitlement and his willingness to exploit people who loved him. I'd defended him then, but she'd been absolutely right. Trevor had spent 2 years treating me like a mark in a con game, never realizing that his mark was a woman who'd been planning for exactly this contingency since the day she noticed his predatory interest in her assets. He thought he was stealing from a vulnerable, trusting mother. Instead, he'd just committed multiple felonies against someone who'd been documenting his every move for months, building an ironclad legal case that would destroy him professionally and personally for years to come. The student was about to learn that his teacher had been holding back the most important lesson of all. After ending my call with Carla, I didn't immediately spring into action like some vengeful mother in a television drama. Instead, I did what I'd learned to do during 18 years of trauma nursing. I took a deep breath, assessed the full scope of the situation, and developed a methodical plan that would achieve the best possible outcome with the least amount of collateral damage. Trevor had acted impulsively and emotionally despite all his careful planning. I was going to respond with the cold precision of someone who understood that sustainable victories require patience and professional execution. My first call was to Dr. Patricia Montez, my primary care physician and a friend who'd been treating me for the past 12 years. Patricia wasn't just my doctor. She was someone I trusted implicitly, and I needed her professional assessment of my mental state during this crisis to be thoroughly documented. "Dorothy, how are you feeling after the surgery?" Patricia asked when I reached her answering service. "Physically, I'm recovering well. Mentally, I need your help with something that's going to sound incredible, but I need you to document our conversation and my cognitive state during this call." I explained Trevor's betrayal in clinical, factual terms, the same way I'd present a patient case to an attending physician. Patricia listened without interruption, asking only clarifying questions about timing and specifics. When I finished, there was a long pause. "Dorothy, I need to ask you some standard cognitive assessment questions, and I want you to know I'm recording this conversation with your permission for legal documentation purposes. Can you tell me today's date, your location, and why you're calling me?" For the next 20 minutes, Patricia put me through a comprehensive mental status evaluation, testing my memory, reasoning ability, and emotional state. She asked about my pain levels, my medication regimen, and whether I felt I was thinking clearly enough to make important decisions. Every question and answer was recorded and would become part of my medical record, establishing that despite being 2 days post-surgery, I was mentally competent and fully aware of the implications of my situation. Based on this assessment, you're demonstrating complete cognitive function, appropriate emotional responses to an extreme stressor, and sound judgment. I'm going to recommend that you continue with whatever legal actions you're planning because, from a medical standpoint, you're making rational decisions under extraordinary circumstances.
That documentation would be crucial if Trevor later tried to claim that his actions were justified because I was mentally incapacitated or unable to make sound financial decisions. Patricia's assessment proved that I was not only competent, but thinking more clearly than I had in months. My next call was to James Morrison, the financial advisor who'd been managing my retirement and investment accounts for the past 8 years. James had helped me build a diversified portfolio that would ensure my security in retirement, and he'd also been instrumental in setting up the financial structures that Trevor had failed to discover. "James, I need you to implement the family protection protocols we discussed 6 months ago," I said when he answered. "Has there been an incident?" he asked immediately, his tone shifting to full professional alert. "My son just sold my house while I was in surgery, using forged documents and fraudulent authorization." "Jesus, Dorothy. Okay, I'm implementing the lockdown procedures right now. All your accounts are being flagged for unauthorized access attempts, and I'm notifying the fraud departments at every institution where you have assets. How much did he steal?"
As I explained the details of Trevor's scheme, James worked through his emergency checklist, securing every possible avenue Trevor might use to access additional funds. Within 30 minutes, my credit cards were frozen and reissued, my bank accounts required dual authorization for any withdrawals over $500, and automatic alerts were set up to notify both James and me of any attempts to access my financial information. The good news is that he can't actually complete the house sale, James explained. The trust structure prevents that, but we need to make sure he doesn't try to access other assets while he's panicking about the house deal falling through. But James's most important contribution was something Trevor couldn't have anticipated: a comprehensive financial audit trail. For the past 6 months, following our initial conversation about protecting assets from family members, James had been meticulously documenting every unusual transaction or inquiry related to my accounts. I've got records of 3 separate attempts by someone claiming to be you trying to access account information online, James told me. The attempts came from your home IP address on days when you were working at the hospital. I flagged them as suspicious and required additional verification, which was never provided. Trevor was trying to hack my financial accounts? Unsuccessfully, but yes. I've also got documentation of someone calling our office twice, claiming to be your son and asking about your investment balances and retirement projections. Our policy is never to discuss client information with family members without explicit written authorization, so we denied those requests and documented them. This evidence would be devastating for Trevor if the case went to court. It proved that his theft of the house wasn't an impulsive decision, but part of a systematic campaign to access and steal my assets. The pattern of attempted financial intrusion would support charges of identity theft and fraud conspiracy in addition to the house-related crimes. My third call was to Linda Vasquez, the investigator from Midwest Title Insurance who specialized in real estate fraud cases. Carla had connected me with Linda during our initial planning sessions, explaining that most title fraud cases required specialized investigation to build a prosecutable case. "Miss Ashford, I've been expecting your call," Linda said when I reached her. "Carla Rodriguez contacted me this morning about your situation. I've already started preliminary research on the fraudulent sale transaction." Linda's efficiency was remarkable. In the few hours since Carla had briefed her, she'd already identified the real estate agent Trevor had worked with, the buyers who unknowingly purchased a house that wasn't legally for sale, and the title company that had processed the fraudulent transaction without proper verification. "Your son chose the wrong professionals to work with," Linda explained. "The real estate agent he used has a history of cutting corners on documentation, and the title company failed to follow standard verification procedures for a sale involving someone who was supposedly incapacitated. They're both facing potential license revocation and civil liability." But Linda's investigation had uncovered something even more damning. Trevor hadn't just forged my signature on the sale documents, he'd created an entire false identity for me, complete with fake ID and fabricated power of attorney documents that purported to give him authority to sell my property. "Identity theft is a federal crime," Linda continued. "Your son didn't just steal your house, he stole your identity to do it. The penalties for that include mandatory minimum prison sentences and permanent felony records that will follow him for the rest of his life." The scope of Trevor's criminal exposure was staggering. What he thought was a clever real estate transaction was actually a constellation of state and federal crimes that could result in decades of legal consequences. He'd committed identity theft, wire fraud, elder abuse, real estate fraud, and conspiracy to commit theft, all while creating a documented trail of evidence that would make prosecutions straightforward.
My final call was to Detective Maria Santos with the Denver Police Department's Economic Crimes Unit, someone I'd met professionally when we'd had to involve law enforcement in cases of suspected elder abuse at the hospital. Maria specialized in cases where family members exploited vulnerable relatives, and she'd given me her direct number months ago when I'd mentioned my concerns about Trevor's behavior. "Dorothy, I heard about your surgery. How are you recovering?" Maria asked when I reached her. "I'm recovering fine, but I need to report multiple felonies committed by my son while I was unconscious on the operating table." Maria's response was immediate and professional. She arranged to come to the hospital that afternoon to take my formal statement, and she coordinated with Linda Vasquez to ensure that all evidence was properly collected and documented for prosecution. Cases like this are actually easier to prosecute than most people think, Maria explained. Your son created so much documentation of his crimes that we'll have no trouble proving intent and premeditation. The hard part is usually getting victims to cooperate with prosecution because they don't want to see their family member go to prison. Detective Santos, I said, my son made a calculated decision to destroy me financially while I was fighting for my life. He's going to face the full consequences of that decision. As I hung up from that final call, I realized that in the space of 6 hours, I'd assembled a team of professionals who were going to methodically dismantle Trevor's life with the same precision he'd used to plan his attack on mine. But unlike his scheme, which was built on deception and betrayal, my response was built on legal precedent, documented evidence, and professional expertise. Trevor had thought he was playing chess against someone who didn't know the rules. Instead, he just declared war on someone who'd spent months preparing for exactly this battle, with allies he didn't know existed and weapons he couldn't have imagined. The first domino fell at exactly 2:30 p.m. on Wednesday, 72 hours after Trevor had sent me that triumphant text message about selling my house. I was sitting up in bed, finally able to move without the sharp spinal pain that had plagued me for 3 years, when my phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. I answered with the calm professionalism I'd learned from years of taking emergency calls at the hospital. "Is this Dorothy Ashford?" The voice was male, agitated, with a slight Texas accent. "This is Dorothy. Who am I speaking with?" "This is Brad Hutchinson from Lone Star Properties in Austin. Ma'am, I think there's been some kind of mistake with the house purchase we completed yesterday. My clients just found out that the property they bought isn't actually legally for sale." I let the silence stretch for a moment, savoring the panic in his voice. Brad Hutchinson was the real estate agent Trevor had somehow convinced to handle the sale without proper verification procedures. According to Linda Vasquez's investigation, Brad had a reputation for cutting corners and processing deals quickly to maximize his commission volume. Now his shortcut was about to become a career-ending disaster. "Mr. Hutchinson," I said calmly, "there hasn't been a mistake. Your clients attempted to purchase a house that belongs to the Ashford Family Trust using fraudulent documents provided by someone who had no legal authority to sell trust property. What you've discovered is that you've been the victim of a real estate fraud scheme." "But the seller provided all the documentation. The deed, the power of attorney, everything looked legitimate." "The power of attorney was fabricated. The person who claimed to be authorized to sell my house forged my signature while I was unconscious during major spinal surgery. Mr. Hutchinson, you and your clients are victims of multiple felonies, and I suggest you contact your attorney immediately." The line went quiet except for the sound of Brad Hutchinson's increasingly rapid breathing. "Ma'am, my clients paid $420,000 for this house. They've already arranged moving trucks, given notice at their apartment, transferred their utilities. What are you saying, that they don't own the house they bought?" "That's exactly what I'm saying. The sale was fraudulent from the beginning, which means your money was stolen through identity theft and real estate fraud. They need to contact their bank immediately to report the wire transfer as fraudulent and begin the process of recovering their funds." I could hear papers rustling in the background, probably Brad frantically searching through the sale documents, looking for something that would make this nightmare go away. But there was nothing to find because Trevor had been thorough in his deception. The documents looked legitimate because he'd spent months learning exactly what legitimate documents should look like.
"Who should I tell my clients to contact?" Brad asked, his voice now completely deflated. "They should start with the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center, since wire fraud across state lines is a federal crime. They should also contact their attorney, their bank's fraud department, and their title insurance company. The Denver Police Economic Crimes Unit is already investigating, and Detective Maria Santos will need statements from everyone involved." As I hung up from Brad Hutchinson, I felt the first wave of satisfaction I'd experienced since reading Trevor's betrayal message. This wasn't revenge. This was justice beginning to unfold exactly as I'd planned. Trevor's victims were discovering the scope of his deception, and each discovery would add another layer to his legal exposure. 20 minutes later, my phone rang again. This time, it was Trevor.
Mom, what the hell is going on? His voice was tight with barely controlled panic. I just got a call from some real estate agent saying the house sale was fraudulent. He's talking about FBI investigations and wire fraud. What did you do? For 48 hours, I'd been waiting for this moment, the moment when Trevor realized that his carefully planned theft had just blown up in his face. I'd imagined dozens of responses, from furious confrontation to cold silence. Instead, I found myself speaking with the same calm professionalism I used when delivering devastating news to families in the emergency room. Trevor, I didn't do anything. You sold a house that you don't own using forged documents and fabricated authorization while I was unconscious during surgery. What's happening now is the natural consequence of committing multiple felonies. But you never told me about any trust. The house is in your name. I checked the public records. The public records you checked were 6 months out of date. The house has belonged to the Ashford Family Trust since last September, with security provisions specifically designed to prevent exactly what you just attempted to do. I could hear Trevor's breathing becoming more rapid, more shallow. The reality of his situation was beginning to penetrate the fog of entitlement and self-justification that had allowed him to rationalize stealing from his mother. This is insane, Mom. I was trying to help you. The medical bills alone would have bankrupted you. And with your back problems, you can't keep working those long shifts. I was protecting your financial future. The audacity of his lie was breathtaking, but it wasn't unexpected. Trevor had always been skilled at reframing his selfishness as sacrifice, his exploitation as protection. But this time, his audience wasn't the loving mother who'd spent 2 years making excuses for his behavior. It was the woman who'd spent 6 months preparing for exactly this conversation. Trevor, I didn't sell my house to protect me. I sold it to pay off your student loans and fund your lifestyle. I have recordings of you researching my net worth and calculating how much my death would be worth to you. I have documentation of your attempts to hack my financial accounts. I have video evidence of you meeting with real estate agents in my house while I was at work. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When Trevor finally spoke, his voice had changed completely. The panic was gone, replaced by something colder and more calculating. You recorded me? You've been spying on your own son? I've been protecting myself from someone who was clearly planning to steal from me. The surveillance wasn't for my entertainment, Trevor. It was insurance against exactly the conversation we're having right now. So what happens now? You're going to have me arrested? Destroy your own son's life over a misunderstanding? That word, misunderstanding, crystallized everything I'd learned about Trevor's character over the past 2 years. Even caught red-handed, even facing federal charges, even confronted with overwhelming evidence of his premeditated theft, he still couldn't acknowledge what he actually done. In his mind, he was still the victim, still the wronged party who deserved sympathy and understanding. Trevor, there's no misunderstanding here. You committed identity theft, real estate fraud, wire fraud, and elder abuse. You stole $420,000 from innocent buyers who trusted you to sell them a house you didn't own. You destroyed a Texas family's dreams of home ownership to pay off your student loans. This isn't a family dispute. It's a crime spree. I can fix this, he said quickly. I can call the buyers, explain the situation, return their money. We don't need to involve lawyers and police and all this legal drama. This is between family. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Trevor genuinely seemed to believe that his charm and manipulation skills could somehow undo federal crimes, that his ability to talk his way out of consequences would work even now. He had spent so many years avoiding accountability that he couldn't comprehend a situation where his actions had created unavoidable legal consequences.
Trevor, it's too late to fix this. The moment you forged my signature and stole that money, you committed crimes that have mandatory minimum sentences. The FBI doesn't negotiate with criminals because their mothers ask nicely. You're really going to do this? You're going to send your own son to prison? I'm not sending you anywhere, Trevor. You sent yourself to prison when you decided to steal from me while I was fighting for my life on an operating table. I'm just declining to lie for you or cover up your crimes the way I've been covering up your failures for the past 2 years. I could hear him starting to cry, not the genuine tears of remorse, but the manipulative sobbing he'd used since childhood to escape consequences for his actions. 24 hours ago, those tears would have broken my heart. Now they sounded like the pathetic whimpering of a predator who'd finally been caught. Mom, please, I made a mistake. I wasn't thinking clearly. You can't destroy my entire future over one bad decision. Trevor, this wasn't one bad decision. This was a 6-month conspiracy that you planned while living in my house, eating my food, and spending my money. You researched my vulnerabilities, documented my assets, and waited for the perfect moment to strike. That's not a mistake. That's premeditated theft. The line went dead. Trevor had hung up, probably to call a lawyer, or maybe to start planning his next move. But it didn't matter what he did next, because every action he took from this point forward would only make his legal situation worse. Within the next hour, my phone would ring 6 more times. Trevor's panicked callbacks, each more desperate than the last, as he began to understand the scope of the legal avalanche he'd triggered. But I didn't answer those calls. I'd said everything I needed to say, and Trevor had heard everything he needed to hear. The next phase of his education would come from federal investigators, and that lesson I was going to let him learn on his own. Over the next 24 hours, Trevor's desperation evolved through every stage of manipulation I'd witnessed during his childhood, his adolescence, and his 2 years of living in my house. But this time, instead of the loving mother who'd always found ways to excuse his behavior, he was dealing with someone who understood his tactics better than he did, because I was the one who'd inadvertently taught them to him. The first wave of calls came Thursday morning, starting at 6 a.m. Trevor had clearly been up all night, probably researching his legal exposure and realizing the magnitude of what he'd done. His strategy was pure Trevor. Overwhelming emotional manipulation combined with accusations designed to make me feel guilty for his predicament. Mom, I've been thinking all night about our conversation. I think you're having some kind of breakdown. The surgery, the medications, the stress, it's affecting your judgment. You're not thinking clearly about what you're doing to our family. It was a sophisticated approach, and 24 hours ago, it might have worked. Trevor was suggesting that my response to his theft was evidence of medical complications, that my decision to pursue legal action was proof of diminished mental capacity. He was trying to position himself as the concerned son, trying to protect his mentally unstable mother from making decisions he'd regret later. Trevor, I had a comprehensive cognitive assessment from Dr. Montez yesterday. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years. What you're experiencing isn't my breakdown, it's the legal system responding to your felonies. Legal system? Mom, this is family business. We don't air our dirty laundry in public. We don't destroy each other over money. That's not who we are. You're right that this is family business. It's the business of a family member committing identity theft against me while I was unconscious during surgery. But it stopped being private family business the moment you involved innocent victims in Texas and committed federal crimes. I could hear him switching tactics in real time, abandoning the concerned son approach for something more aggressive. You know what I think? I think you've been planning this for months. I think you set me up, created some kind of legal trap, and now you're using it to destroy me because you're angry about Amanda leaving me. The projection was stunning.
Trevor was accusing me of the exact behavior he actually engaged in: months of planning, legal maneuvering, and strategic deception. It was a classic manipulation technique. Accuse your victim of your own crimes to muddy the waters and create false equivalency. Trevor, I didn't set you up. I protected myself from you after you started researching my net worth and asking suspicious questions about my insurance coverage. Everything that's happening to you now is the direct result of choices you made, not traps I set up.
The second wave of manipulation came Thursday afternoon, this time involving other people in what Trevor probably thought was a brilliant escalation strategy. My phone rang at 2 p.m., and the caller ID showed Amanda's number, Trevor's ex-wife, who I hadn't spoken to since their divorce 2 years ago. "Dorothy, I'm so sorry to bother you while you're recovering," Amanda said, her voice tight with stress. "Trevor called me this morning, and he's saying some really concerning things about your mental state and some kind of legal trouble." It was masterful manipulation. Trevor had reached out to Amanda, probably presenting himself as the worried son dealing with his mother's post-surgical mental breakdown. He'd likely painted a picture of me making irrational decisions while under the influence of pain medication, pursuing legal action against my own son because I was confused and vulnerable. "Amanda, what exactly did Trevor tell you?" "He said you're accusing him of stealing your house while you were in surgery and that you've called the FBI and are trying to have him arrested." "Dorothy, that sounds... Trevor can be irresponsible, but he wouldn't steal from you. Are you sure you're thinking clearly about this?" Even Amanda, who'd laughed Trevor specifically because of his lack of accountability and entitlement issues, had been convinced that his theft accusations were evidence of my mental instability rather than documentation of his actual crimes. Trevor's manipulation skills were more sophisticated than I'd given him credit for. "Amanda, Trevor didn't just steal my house, he forged my signature, created fake power of attorney documents, and sold a property worth over $400,000 to innocent buyers in Texas. The FBI is involved because identity theft and wire fraud across state lines are federal crimes. This isn't a family dispute, it's a criminal investigation." The silence stretched for nearly a minute before Amanda spoke again, her voice much quieter. "Dorothy, are you saying this actually happened? Trevor actually stole your house?" "He attempted to steal my house. The sale was fraudulent and can't be completed, but he did steal over $400,000 from the buyers who thought they were purchasing legitimate property. Those people are victims of Trevor's crimes, just like I am." "Oh my God, Dorothy, I'm so sorry. When he called me, he sounded so convincing, so worried about you. He said you were making decisions you'd regret later, that the family needed to intervene before you destroyed your relationship with your only son." "Amanda, Trevor is facing federal charges and potential prison time. His response has been to convince everyone who knows me I'm mentally incompetent, rather than acknowledge what he's done. That should tell you everything you need to know about his character." The third wave came Thursday evening, and it was the most sophisticated manipulation Trevor had attempted yet. My hospital room phone rang at 8 p.m., and when I answered, I heard Trevor's voice along with someone else, a woman with a professional tone who introduced herself as Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a psychiatrist specializing in post-surgical cognitive issues. "Ms. Harper, I'm calling because your son has expressed serious concerns about your mental state following your recent surgery. He's described some very concerning behaviors and decision-making patterns that could indicate post-operative delirium or medication-related psychiatric side effects." Trevor had actually hired a psychiatrist to evaluate me remotely, based entirely on his description of my concerning behaviors. It was brilliant, manipulative, and completely consistent with his pattern of using professional authority to validate his version of reality. Dr. Harper, before we continue this conversation, I need to inform you that Trevor is currently under FBI investigation for identity theft, wire fraud, and real estate fraud. The concerning behaviors he's describing are my cooperation with law enforcement in a criminal investigation. Are you aware that your patient is facing federal charges? The line went quiet. When Dr. Harper spoke again, her tone had changed completely. I was not aware of any criminal investigation. Mr. Ashford presented this as a family dispute over financial decisions made while you were medically compromised. Dr. Harper, I suggest you verify the facts of this case with the Denver Police Economic Crimes Unit. Detective Maria Santos can provide you with documentation of the crimes that have been committed. After Dr. Harper ended the call, probably to research whether she'd just been manipulated into participating in a criminal conspiracy, Trevor's voice came back on the line, no longer accompanied by professional backup. You can't keep doing this, Mom. You can't turn everyone against me just because you're angry. Trevor, I'm not turning anyone against you. You're destroying your own relationships by lying to people about federal crimes and trying to manipulate them into questioning my mental competency. Every person you contact becomes a potential witness to your continued attempts to cover up your theft through deception.
This isn't over, Trevor said, his voice now carrying a tone I'd never heard before. Cold, threatening, completely stripped of the pretense of filial affection. You're right, it's not over, I replied. It's going to continue until you're in federal prison, serving the mandatory minimum sentence for identity theft and wire fraud. And every manipulation attempt you make between now and then is just going to be additional evidence of your lack of remorse and your continued threat to potential victims. The line went dead, but this time I knew Trevor wasn't hanging up to regroup for another manipulation attempt. He was hanging up because he'd finally exhausted his arsenal of emotional weapons and realized that none of them worked against someone who understood exactly what he was doing and why. Within an hour, Detective Santos called to inform me that Trevor had just made his situation exponentially worse by attempting to manipulate a psychiatrist into providing false evidence of my mental incompetency. The attempted manipulation of a medical professional in connection with a federal crime was itself a federal crime, and Trevor had just handed prosecutors additional charges that would ensure he spent significantly more time in prison. The student had just learned the most important lesson of all. When you're in a hole, stop digging. Unfortunately for Trevor, he'd learned it too late to save himself. Friday morning at 10:15 a.m., exactly 5 days after Trevor had sent me that triumphant text message about selling my house, he walked into my hospital room uninvited. I was sitting up in bed reviewing financial documents that James Morrison had brought for my signature when I looked up to see my son standing in the doorway with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of desperation, rage, and something that looked dangerously close to hatred. He'd clearly been awake for days. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair unwashed, and his eyes had the hollow, manic quality of someone who'd been living on adrenaline and panic for too long. This wasn't the composed, calculating man who'd spent 2 years systematically researching my vulnerabilities while playing the role of grieving son. This was someone whose carefully constructed world had collapsed in less than a week, leaving him face to face with consequences he'd never imagined possible. "We need to talk," he said, closing the door behind him with a deliberate click that sent a chill down my spine. I pressed the call button for the nurse, not because I was afraid of Trevor physically, but because I wanted witnesses to whatever conversation we were about to have. Jenny Martinez appeared in the doorway within 30 seconds, took one look at Trevor's agitated state, and positioned herself where she could monitor the situation while maintaining professional distance. "Trevor, visiting hours don't start until noon, and you're not on the approved visitor list," Jenny said with the calm authority of someone who dealt with difficult family members countless times. "I'm her son," Trevor replied without taking his eyes off me. I need to speak with my mother privately about urgent family business. Actually, Trevor isn't welcome here, I said, my voice steadied despite the tension crackling in the air. He's currently under FBI investigation for identity theft and fraud, and I've requested that he have no unsupervised access to me or my medical information. Jenny's hand moved toward the security alert button, but I shook my head slightly. I wanted this conversation to happen, wanted Trevor to have one final opportunity to show me exactly who he'd become, because I suspected that any remaining doubt about my decision to prosecute him was about to disappear permanently. 5 minutes, she said, positioning herself where she could see both of us clearly, and the door stays open. Trevor waited until Jenny stepped back before moving closer to my bed, his movements sharp and aggressive in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of his father during our worst arguments 23 years ago. When he spoke, his voice was low and controlled, but I could hear the fury vibrating beneath the surface. "I know what you did," he said. "I've spent the last 3 days with lawyers, and they explained exactly how you set me up. The trust, the security cameras, the insurance policies. You planned this whole thing months ago. You wanted me to try to sell the house so you could destroy me." The accusation was so perfectly Trevor, taking his own calculated behavior and projecting it onto me, that I almost laughed. Even now, even facing federal charges, even caught red-handed with overwhelming evidence of his premeditated theft, he couldn't acknowledge his own responsibility. In his mind, he was still the victim of an elaborate conspiracy rather than the perpetrator of multiple felonies. "Trevor, I protected myself from you after you started showing signs that you might try to steal from me. Everything that's happening to you now is the direct result of your decision to commit those crimes, not the result of my decision to protect myself from them."
Protect yourself? His voice rose sharply, and Jenny stepped closer to the bed. "I lived in your house for 2 years. I took care of you, supported you, helped you through your medical problems. And the whole time, you were treating me like a criminal, recording me, documenting everything I did like I was some kind of threat. The revisionist history was breathtaking. Trevor had transformed 2 years of financial exploitation into 2 years of caregiving, 2 years of calculating theft into 2 years of filial support. He'd convinced himself that his research into my net worth and his attempts to hack my financial accounts were evidence of his concern for my welfare rather than documentation of his predatory intentions. Trevor, you didn't take care of me. You lived off me while planning to steal from me. The recordings show you going through my financial documents, photographing my personal papers, and meeting with real estate agents to discuss selling property you didn't own. That's not caregiving. That's surveillance and conspiracy. "I was trying to help you plan for the future," he snapped. "You're 51 years old with back problems that are getting worse every year. How much longer did you think you could keep working those brutal shifts? I was trying to make sure you had financial security when you couldn't work anymore. By stealing my house and using the money to pay off your student loans?" The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Trevor's face cycled through several expressions: surprise, anger, calculation, before settling on something that looked like cold contempt. "You want to know the truth, Mom? Fine. Yes, I was going to use some of the money for my loans, but I was also going to invest the rest for your future. Make sure you had enough to live on when your body finally gave out. I was thinking long-term, planning ahead, doing what you were too emotional to do yourself." It was a masterful lie, perfectly crafted to sound reasonable while justifying theft as financial planning. But there was one problem with Trevor's story. I'd seen his notebook, the one where he'd calculated my net worth and estimated timelines for my death or disability. There had been no investment plans, no provisions for my care, just calculations of how much my demise would be worth to him. "Trevor, I saw your notebook. The one where you calculated my life expectancy and estimated how much money you'd inherit when I died. There was no investment plan, no provision for my care. You were calculating how much my death would be worth to you."
For the first time since he'd entered the room, Trevor's composure cracked completely. His face flushed red, his hands clenched into fists, and when he spoke, his voice carried the raw fury of someone whose lies had been stripped away to reveal the ugly truth beneath. "You know what your problem is, Mom? Fine. Yes, I was going to use some of the money for my loans, but I was also going to invest the rest for your future. Make sure you had enough to live on when your body finally gave out. I was thinking long-term, planning ahead, doing what you were too emotional to do yourself." The mask was finally off. This wasn't the grieving son who needed my mother's support, or the concerned adult child worried about my financial security. This was the entitled, resentful man who'd been hiding behind a facade of filial devotion while planning to steal everything I'd built. "So this is what you really think? That I deserve to be stolen from because I worked hard to build a life for us? That my sacrifices were selfishness and your theft was justice? You think you created this whole situation because you couldn't stand the idea that I might not need you anymore. You set up legal traps and security cameras because you wanted to make sure I'd always be dependent on you, always be grateful, always be under your control. And when I tried to take some initiative, tried to solve our financial problems myself, you destroyed me for it." The psychological projection was so complete, so perfectly inverted that I found myself studying Trevor with the same clinical detachment I used to assess patients in crisis. He'd taken his own behavior, the surveillance, the manipulation, the calculated exploitation, and attributed it to me. In his mind, I was the predator, and he was the victim. I was the manipulator, and he was the innocent target. "Trevor, I knew somebody who housed a person for 2 years, managed to pay off some debt, and will still receive a gift. And you know what the really sick part is?" Trevor's voice had dropped to a whisper, but the fury in it was unmistakable. "You're enjoying this. You're enjoying watching me suffer, watching my life fall apart, watching me face prison time. You finally have the power to destroy me, and you're loving every minute of it."
I looked at my son, this stranger wearing Trevor's face, speaking with Trevor's voice, but revealing a character I'd never seen before, and felt something I hadn't expected: profound sadness. Not for what he was facing, but for what he'd never been. The loving, grateful son had been a performance. The concerned adult child had been a manipulation. The person I'd sacrificed for, worried about, and tried to help had never actually existed. "Trevor, I'm not enjoying your suffering. I'm enforcing consequences for choices you made. If you're in pain right now, it's because you're finally facing accountability for actions that should have horrified you, but apparently didn't." He stared at me for a long moment, his breathing rapid and shallow, his hands still clenched into fists. When he finally spoke, his voice was eerily calm. "This isn't over, Mom. You think you've won, but you haven't. I'll find a way to fix this, and when I do, you're going to regret everything you've done to me." "Trevor," I said as he turned toward the door, "it is over. The moment you decided to steal from me while I was fighting for my life, you ended our relationship permanently. There's no fixing this, no going back, no reconciliation. You're going to federal prison, and when you get out, you'll be a convicted felon who stole from his own mother. That's your legacy now." He stopped in the doorway, his back to me, his shoulders rigid with tension. For a moment, I thought he might turn around, might finally acknowledge what he'd done, might show some glimpse of remorse or understanding. Instead, he walked away without another word, leaving behind only the echo of his threats and the absolute certainty that the son I'd raised was gone, if he had ever existed at all. 6 months later, I was standing in the kitchen of my house, my actual house, the one that legally belonged to the Ashford Family Trust and had never been Trevor's to sell, preparing dinner for someone I'd never expected to have in my life, Amanda, Trevor's ex-wife, who'd become one of my closest friends and strongest supporters during the legal proceedings that had redefined both our understandings of the man we'd both tried to love. The transformation in my life hadn't happened overnight. Recovery from spinal surgery was a slow process, made more complex by the emotional trauma of discovering that my son was a calculating criminal who'd viewed me as a long-term financial target rather than his mother.
But as my body healed and the legal case against Trevor progressed through the federal court system, I'd begun to experience something I hadn't felt in years: genuine peace. The legal resolution had been swift and decisive. Trevor's attempt to manipulate Dr. Harper into providing false evidence of my mental incompetency had backfired spectacularly, adding witness tampering and obstruction of justice to his already substantial list of federal charges. The video evidence from my security cameras, combined with the financial documentation James Morrison had compiled, and the testimony from the Texas buyers Trevor had defrauded, created an overwhelming case that even Trevor's expensive attorney couldn't meaningfully contest. In the end, Trevor had accepted a plea agreement that sentenced him to 4 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation and mandatory restitution payments to his victims. The plea hearing had been the last time I'd seen him, and his behavior that day had confirmed every decision I'd made about prosecution. Even facing prison time, even confronted with irrefutable evidence of his crimes, Trevor had shown no remorse for the people he hurt, only anger that his carefully planned theft had been discovered and thwarted. But the most profound transformation hadn't been in Trevor's legal status. It had been in my understanding of family, loyalty, and what it meant to love someone without enabling their destruction of themselves and others. Amanda had been instrumental in that transformation. After our phone conversation during Trevor's desperate manipulation campaign, she'd started calling regularly to check on my recovery and share her own experiences of being exploited by Trevor's sense of entitlement and selective accountability. Through our conversations, I had begun to understand that Trevor's behavior toward me hadn't been an aberration caused by his divorce. It had been a pattern that stretched back to his childhood, one that I had inadvertently reinforced by consistently shielding him from consequences. I spent 3 years married to him, 3 years making excuses for his behavior, covering for his failures, convincing myself that if I just loved him enough, supported him enough, he'd eventually become the man I needed him to be. Sound familiar? It did sound familiar, painfully so. Amanda was right during her divorce. Trevor had been counting on my death or disability to fund his lifestyle, rather than building his own financial security. What she saw as his lack of ambition and responsibility, I saw as depression and grief. We'd both been manipulated by someone who was skilled at presenting his exploitation as vulnerability.
But our friendship had also revealed something beautiful. It was possible to love someone's potential while refusing to enable their refusal to reach it. Amanda and I had both been guilty of conflating unconditional love with unconditional tolerance, mistaking enabling behavior for compassion. Learning to set boundaries hadn't made us less loving. It had made our love more honest and more sustainable. The house had become a symbol of that transformation. Instead of the burden Trevor had characterized it as, it had become a sanctuary where I could heal physically and emotionally while building healthier relationships with people who understood reciprocity and respect. Amanda visited regularly, bringing dinner and conversation. Jenny Martinez and several of my nursing colleagues had become frequent guests, creating a chosen family that operated on mutual support rather than one-sided exploitation. My work life had transformed as well. The forced medical leave during my recovery had given me time to reconsider my career priorities, and I'd decided to transition from trauma nursing to education. I was now training new nurses, teaching them not just medical skills, but also how to recognize and protect themselves from the kind of family exploitation I'd experienced. My story had become a cautionary tale that helped younger nurses understand the importance of financial protection and boundary setting with family members who might view their earning potential as an inheritance opportunity. The most unexpected transformation had been in my relationship with money and security. For 23 years, I'd worked myself to physical exhaustion trying to build financial stability, driven by the fear of ending up vulnerable and dependent like I'd been when Richard left. But Trevor's theft attempt had taught me that the greatest threat to my security hadn't been external economic forces.
It had been my own reluctance to acknowledge that someone I loved was actively working against my interests. The trust structure that had protected my house had evolved into a comprehensive financial plan designed not just for my retirement, but for my ability to help other women in similar situations. With Carla Rodriguez's help, I'd established a foundation that provided legal and financial resources to people dealing with exploitation by family members. The foundation's first client had been the Texas family that Trevor had defrauded. I'd helped cover their legal costs and moving expenses while they rebuilt their dream of home ownership. But perhaps the most profound change had been in my understanding of forgiveness and accountability. Well-meaning friends and colleagues often asked if I planned to reconcile with Trevor when he was released from prison, if I thought family therapy might help us rebuild our relationship, if I felt guilty about sending my own son to jail. The questions always carried an implicit assumption that good mothers should forgive anything, tolerate any behavior, maintain hope for redemption regardless of evidence. I'd learned to respond with calm clarity. Forgiveness didn't require relationship, and love didn't require enablement. I could forgive Trevor for what he'd done without trusting him with access to my life. I could hope for his personal growth without taking responsibility for his choices. I could love the memory of the child I'd raised without accepting abuse from the man he'd become. The foundation's work had introduced me to dozens of other parents dealing with similar betrayals. Elderly fathers whose sons had emptied their retirement accounts, mothers whose daughters had stolen their identities to open credit lines, grandparents who discovered that their financial support was funding addiction or gambling rather than the stated emergencies. The common thread in all these stories wasn't the specific nature of the theft, but the family and social pressure on victims to minimize the crimes, excuse the behavior, and prioritize family harmony over justice and accountability. Through the foundation, I'd learned that my situation with Trevor wasn't unique or shameful. It was unfortunately common, and it thrived in silence and secrecy. By speaking openly about what had happened, by refusing to protect Trevor's reputation at the expense of truth, I'd helped other families understand they weren't alone, and that accountability wasn't betrayal. As I stood in my kitchen that evening, preparing dinner for Amanda and looking forward to a quiet evening of conversation and mutual support, I realized that Trevor's betrayal had ultimately been a gift, though not one I would have ever chosen. It had forced me to stop living in fear of vulnerability and start building genuine security based on healthy relationships, legal protection, and honest communication about boundaries and expectations. The woman who'd woken up from surgery to discover her son's theft had been someone who confused sacrifice with love, enabling with support, and fear with caution. The woman I'd become understood that real love sometimes required enforcement of consequences, that genuine support meant refusing to participate in someone's self-destruction, and that true security came from building relationships with people who understood reciprocity and respect.
I would never stop loving the child I'd raised, but I would also never again confuse that love with tolerance for criminal behavior. Trevor had taught me the difference between unconditional love and unconditional enablement, and that lesson had transformed not just my relationship with him, but my understanding of what it meant to protect and care for the people who truly deserved my trust and investment. The house that Trevor had tried to steal had become the foundation for a life that was richer, safer, and more honest than anything I'd built before his betrayal forced me to examine who I was and who I wanted to become. And every evening, as I locked the doors that protected my sanctuary, I felt grateful. Not for what I'd lost, but for what I'd finally learned to keep. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.